So we have three events dealing with Richard III. And the first event we had yesterday, it was the talk about the text itself and about the Ukrainian tradition of staging Richard III by Shakespeare in Ukrainian theaters. And today we have a great pleasure and immense privilege to listen to two foreign speakers, our famous Shakespeareans and closest friends, Dr. Імке Ліхтерфелд and Jülí Rebí, who will tell us about the foreign tradition of representation, reading, staging and screening Richard III. So the first speaker is Імке Ліхтерфелд. She is a doctor and the assistant professor, it seems to me, of the University of Bonn. And I had a great pleasure to see Імке some days ago during the York Festival. And there she presented a very interesting panel that was called Shelter for Ukraine. And probably at the end of our meeting today, we'll have an opportunity to speak a little bit about this important project, because really it was very priceless for us to have such friends, such colleagues, and such great supporters of our country who have been helping us for a long period of time with their initiatives, with their events. And today we can say that it is the part of this shelter. It's a part of Shelter for Ukraine. And I do believe that today we'll have an immense pleasure to enjoy these two talks. So, Імке, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Thank you for inviting me to this. Thank you for everybody coming here. And I feel humbled and a little proud. And of course, also still quite devastated at the situation in Ukraine. And Jülí and I are both very humbled that we can join you in this situation. It's wonderful to see so many names that I know in the audience. And most of you know about the multicultural Shakespeare issue, Shakespeare Shelter for Ukraine, which is about to come out. We talked about that in York at the York International Festival last week, about Shakespeare together with Nicoletta Ciampuis and Natalia Torkut, and yes, and that was wonderful, and I hope we'll have a little time at the end of this. What Jülí and I are presenting today is an introduction that we also presented last week at the festival as an introduction to a Romanian version of Richard III, but it is a very general introduction to Richard. I will talk a little about the play itself. Jülí will talk about interpretations, and without further ado, I will start. Jülí will take over. And then there will be a little time for questions afterwards. But thank you all for coming, and thank you, Natalia, for asking us to do this. I will start sharing my presentation, which worked a moment ago. So here we go. I'll go back to the beginning, as one does. Continue to share. Here we go. Can you see the presentation and can you hear me all right? Right, I see Natalia nodding. That's great. Okay, so I'll be about 20-25 minutes max. It's a basic introduction to Richard III with some of the main scenes. With Richard, Duke of Gloucester, a nascent tyrant as the Düsseldorf Schauspielhaus, which is about 1 hour from Bonn, where I work, which what they write on their homepage for a production that they did a few years ago that Jülí and I actually saw together with Saffron Wickers-Walkling and Nicoletta Ciampuis and Anya Kowalczyk-Pawlik. They write, with Richard, Duke of Gloucester, a nascent tyrant enters the stage, proclaiming in the very first scene that he has been handicapped by nature. Born hunchbacked, lame and ugly, he now seeks to seize power and ruin the world. Pure power, which also creates joy and pleasure. This is the fascination with the ugly, combined with the fascination with evil. And today, the both of us are going to give you a prelude to the play. I will focus on 3 pivotal scenes from this historical tragedy that was written around 1592, as you all well know. 1-1, Richard's opening soliloquy, which establishes complicity with the audience. 1-2, the seduction of Lady Anne, which proves a volatile mix of rhetoric and power. And one of the last scenes in the play, Act 5, Scene 3, the ghost sequence that that sets up the shattering finale. Julie will then continue to explain some challenges that putting Richard on stage, not in Ukraine, but especially in Britain, that they pose for creatives and how the transformation of Richard from this charismatic villain to a fractured tyrant can be performed. And I think I will jump over the synopsis because you all know the play, but it's this idea of course, the brother being king while Richard is eager to clear his way to the throne and then manipulating all people, murdering or being responsible for the murder of his brother, his middle brother in the tower, succeeding to marry Lady Anne, who is the daughter-in-law of the previous King Henry VI, of course, whom Richard himself killed. And he also killed her husband, Prince Edward, on the field in battle. When finally King Edward, Richard's old brother, dies, the two young sons in the power and theory next in line to the throne, but they are housed in the tower and they will never be seen again. And all the events in the play yield to Richard basically achieving the crown and being crowned as Richard III. We know that the boys are somehow secretly killed and very likely he was involved. Of course, he also disposes of other people he doesn't use anymore, including the wife that he acquires at the beginning of the play, Anne, in order to court his niece. This is all very incestuous, this family of York. His niece, Elizabeth of York. But, of course, we have the main protagonist being confronted by his enemy, and all the rebellious nobles rally to Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, who then wins against Richard and is crowned Henry VII at the end of the play. And we know that this is, of course, important at Shakespeare's time because Henry's granddaughter, Elizabeth I, was, at that moment, still the Queen of England. So that was a quick jump over the piece itself. It is, as a lot of you will also know, the last play in a sequence. King John and Henry VIII there at the bottom are a little removed, but we have these two tetralogies, Richard II, Henry IV, and Henry V, and then, Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III, which actually prove Henry VI and Richard III the first tetralogy, which, as E.M.W. Tilliard, the new historicist in the 40s, would say, give you this kind of teleological Tudor myth. But we can see the plays all as separate entities. And that's, of course, how I will look at it today. We are just looking at Richard III. Quick jump then to the beginning of the play already. I will read this for you because these lines cannot be heard too often. They are just the most wonderful lines that Shakespeare wrote, so allow me to indulge this. Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this son of York, and all the clouds that lad upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarms changed to merry meetings. Our dreadful marches to delightful measures, grim-visaged war hath smoothed his wrinkled front. And now, instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking glass, I, that am so rudely stamped and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph. I, that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable, that dogs bark at me at I halt by them. Why, I, in this weak piping time of peace, have no delight to pass away the time, unless to see my shadow in the sun and descant on mine own deformity. Therefore, since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair, well-spoken days, I am determinate to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of the day. Plots have I laid. And there I'll finish reading this, you know the end of it. Richard explains the ideas on how at first he's going to get rid of his middle brother. But Plots Have I Laid is the title that we chose for this talk, because it's all about how something is done, how something is presented, how something is strategied. And of course, that is exactly what happens in a performance too, the strategy of a director, for example. Emma Smith, the Oxford professor, calls the play a modern criminal biopic, and she remarks Richard's opening lines are also their most familiar. Their recognizability may obscure just how unusual they really are. What kind of villain do we have who yet ensnares us? Richard speaks in a monologue to himself and to us, to you, to the audience. He involves us. And after this lengthy civil war, peace at last has returned. There is great celebration, but Richard will not join in the festivities. Instead, he joins with us. He complains about his deformed and ugly body and vows to make everybody around him, everybody on stage, everybody else that we are meeting, miserable. He is power hungry and seeks to gain control. Plots have I laid. Richard has set in motion various schemes, the first victim, his own brother Clarence. Richard's primary tactic, Smith continues, in the play is seduction rather than elimination. We, the audience, are the first, reeled in hook, line and sinker, basically angling for us, by his confiding, charismatic, funny opening speech. Richard strategically lays bare his own vulnerabilities. This apparent candor is absolutely beguiling. Wonderful. So how will a Richard be put on stage? How will he lure the audience into his confidence? How is the beginning portrayed on stage, especially if you have a limited cast, or how do we get snared into what he says? We witness more of this ensnarement in scene 1, when Richard woos Lady N over the corpse of King Henry VI, her father-in-law, whom he had murdered. She begins the scene on her own, lamenting, poor cold figure of a holy king, pale ashes of the house of Lancaster, thou bloodless remnant of that royal blood, be it lawful that I invocate thy ghost to hear the lamentations of poor Anne, wife to thy Edward, to thy slaughtered son, stabbed by the selfsame hand that made these wounds. Lady Anne, widow of King Henry VI's son Edward, mourns by the side of the coffin of the king. And then Richard joins her in that scene, whom she at first, of course, curses for having killed the king. Avaunt, thou dreadful minister of hell! Thou hadst but power over his mortal body. His soul thou canst not have. Begone. And here begins his syntax changing, his taking up of words, his changing of whatever she says into something that procures his own success. Sweet saint, for charity, be not so cursed. Of course, she continues, foul devil, for God's sake, hence, trouble us not. For thou hast made the happy earth thy hell. I'll jump a little. Behold this pattern of thy butcheries, pointing to the corpse. Blush, blush, thou lump of foul deformity, O earth, which this blood drink'st, revenge his death. Either heaven with lightning strike the murderer dead, wishing basically his murder, his death right there. Or earth gape open wide and eat him quick, as thou dost swallow up this good king's blood which hell-governed arm hath butchered. But Shakespeare likes his turns, and so do we, the idea of things turning around. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks. Here is a but again. This has not the effect that she wishes, and Richard does not take her bait, if you want to call it that. Instead, praising her gentleness and beauty, he begins to court her romantically in this scene of mourning. She naturally reacts with anger and horror, but Richard is so versatile, he has this linguistic prowess and turns her comments into weak allegations that can be turned around and twisted again. She calls him hedgehog. God grant me too, thou mayst be damned for that wicked deed. He was gentle, talking about King Henry VI again. He was gentle, mild, and virtuous. His twisting, the better for the King of heaven that hath him. Well, it's good he's dead, now he's with God. He is in heaven, she asserts, where thou shalt never come. Let him thank me that holp to send him thither, for he was fitter for that place than earth. We all know that Henry VI was a weak king. And thou unfit for any place but hell. Yes, one place else, if thou will hear me name it. Some dungeon. Some your bedchamber. Richard is bold. He is reckless and indeed determined. He even offers to her to kill him or kill himself. And while she begins to stab him with a knife towards his chest, he continues talking. He just talks at her, saying that he killed out of passion for Anne herself. Anne's beauty drove him to it. He says, but 'twas thy beauty that provoked me. And Anne doesn't know what to do anymore. She lowers the sword. How conniving, how calculating, strategic, how provocative at the same time. So the question that is asked for performances is, how will Richard play with this kind of allure, with this kind of attraction, but at the same time disgust? He wins this scene. She gives up. She agrees to marry him. Strike. When she's left, he gleefully begins to celebrate his conquest. His rise, Act 1, Scene 2, is already taking shape. Was ever woman in this humour wooed? Was ever woman in this humour won? I'll have her, but I will not keep her long. What, I that killed her husband and his father to take her in her heart's extremest hate, with curses in her mouth, tears in her eyes? Has she forgot already that brave Prince Edward, her lord, her husband, whom I some 3 months since stabbed in my angry mood at Tewkesbury? And then he praises her husband, a sweeter and a lovelier gentleman, has never lived more or less. And will she yet abase her eyes on me, that cropped the golden prime of this sweet prince and made her widow to a woeful bed? Yes, that's what she does. Since I am crept in favour with myself, I will maintain it with some little cost. He knows exactly how much to give and how much to give at what time. She did agree. His linguistic bravura ensnares her just as it does with us, the audience. There is so much to dislike about Richard, and yet he's so beguiling, seductive, indeed ravishing. I will jump now to the end of the play, jumping in time towards Richard's end. He achieves what he wants. We know, you all talked about it yesterday. We've read the play. He becomes king. His older brother dies. Edward IV, through sickness. George is murdered. The two princes in the tower are murdered. Richard III reigns. But he is a real moral monster. And as poetic justice needs to have its turn on this wheel of fortune where everything that goes up must come down, in this De Casibus tragedy, a tragedy of the fall of people, that of course must also end in the downfall of this villainous protagonist. The antagonist, Henry Earl of Richmond, will have the day in the scene after this, and will teleologically and deus ex machina like win the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 to revel in this new Tudor age. This outcome is already foreshadowed at the beginning of Act 5. In Scene 3, ghosts visit Richard in his tent on the battlefield, as they do at the same time with his enemy Richmond. As they prepare for battle, Richmond prays, and that's not on this slide yet, to thee, i.e. God, to thee I do commend my watchful soul. He falls asleep. Both are then visited by the ghosts of those that Richard had killed or has had killed. The ghosts curse Richard and cheer Richmond. First of all, the ghost of Prince Edward, son to Harry VI. Let me sit heavy on thy soul tomorrow. Think how thou stabbedst me in my prime of youth at Tewkesbury. Despair and die. And this despair and die is repeated throughout the whole scene. It's something that we talked about last week as well, this idea of there is some kind of poetic justice or even teleological, possibly even religious undertone in that too. While all the ghosts cheer on Richmond. Be cheerful, Richmond, for the wronged souls of butchered princes fight in thy behalf. King Henry's issue, Richmond comforts thee. Next one, the ghost of the former king. When I was mortal, my anointed body by thee, to Richard, was punctured full of deadly holes. Think on the tower and me, despair and die. Harry VI bids thee despair and die. And again the contrast to Richmond. Virtuous and holy, be thou conqueror, live and flourish. And it continues like that. I cut most of the ghosts now. But this repetition of let me sit heavy in thy soul tomorrow, I that was washed to death with fulsome wine, Richard's own brother Clarence. And a parade of ghosts, the spirits of every victim in the play comes in. The ghosts of Rivers, Grey, Vaughan, the two young princes, Edward and Richard, Hastings, Buckingham, and lastly as well, the ghost of Lady Anne, whom we just witnessed being the bride in 1-2. Richard, thy wife, that wretched Anne, thy wife. Jumping there. Tomorrow in the battle, think on me, and fall thy edgeless sword, despair and die. And again the contrast to Richmond, thou quiet soul, sleep, thou a quiet sleep, dream of success and happy victory, thy adversary's wife doth pray for thee. And when Richard then wakes after this scene, he does feel this terrified state which the ghosts have endowed him with. He has his coward conscience, quote, how dost thou afflict me? And he does grant to himself that he is, and says to himself, I am a villain. He does feel guilty. So what about performances? Will the ghosts appear on stage? What do we encounter in the theatre? What do adaptations do? How does Richard appear? Linda Hutcheon, the famous critic on adaptations, writes in The Theory, a wonderful book from 2006, the appeal of adaptations for audiences lies in their mixture of repetition and difference, of familiarity and novelty. So the lines that I've just quoted to you again are familiar, familiar, familiar. But what do adaptations do on stage? What will we see in the theatre? How has Richard been staged in the past, for example, in York? Julie, give us some answers. Thank you for listening to my part.
Thank you very much, Imke, and we are invited to listen to Julie, and I do believe that after that we'll have a lot of questions because the topic is very inspiring and interesting. And now, Julie, you are welcome.
Down at the bottom, click for the presentation. And you need to unmute yourself, exactly. And unmute yourself.
Microphone.
Of course I need to unmute myself as you wouldn't hear me. That would be a disaster, wouldn't it? So thank you, Imke. I love working with Imke. We've been working on the German production of Richard-III, which was a real eye-opener for me, coming from York, which obviously is familiar, Richard of York, and from England, where we have a particular tradition of portraying Richard III in terms of bestial images as metaphors from the text, such as bottle spider or a bunchback toad or a hedgehog. Often the actors take on one of those ideas and portray it throughout the production. So I'm going to talk about a few productions that have taken place in England over the last 10 or so, well, longer than that, 40 years. And I'm going to talk about some of the challenges with those productions. And I'm going to start by talking about productions in York, which is a bit naughty when I'm involved in international Shakespeare and I just stay on my home turf. But there's a reason for that, and I hope it makes sense as I go through. So here I go. Right, have I got to press something on here? Oh yes, I press this, don't I? Yes. So I'm starting off with a scene from what's called the York Mystery Plays. They're performed usually every 4 years in sites around York. Often in all the mystery plays. These are from scenes from the Bible, which were performed by the Guilds of York. So the butchers in York would perform the crucifixion, and other guilds would perform other scenes. Originally, they would go around the town of York on the back of carts. They still do with that now and again. They'll still produce these plays on the back of the carts. But often it's either in York Minster, which Imke and Natalia will have seen when they visited us last week, or in the museum gardens with the Abbey as a backdrop. It's an amateur performance in the tradition of the guilds, except we have one professional actor. And the reason I'm talking about the idea of the mystery plays is that the vice figure, the Satan figure, is kind of an archetype, is a kind of beginning for what we see as Richard III, though Shakespeare actually develops that character and it's much more than a stereotype. But if you think of the vice figure, the seductive devil figure in those old medieval plays, you've got some sense of where maybe Richard III's coming from. And of course, I must say, just in case somebody's going to pull me up on this, and agree with Imke, that this is a Tudor dynasty. This is propaganda. If you're from York, many people in York, and somebody stopped me after the Romanian performance last week and said, yes, but Richard wasn't like that at all. Richard is nothing like Shakespeare's play. And I was trying to say, oh yes, but it's a representation. But they were quite upset being in York to see Richard III performed in such a way. So I'm going back to this vice figure, and one of the productions in York I want to talk about. Richard III was played by David Leonard. Now, David Leonard is very well known in York for playing the pantomime villain. The tradition we have where every Christmas we have a pantomime. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's Cinderella or Mother Goose or Dick Whittington or anything like that. It's usually the very same story. So you have the pantomime dame, probably a model for the nurse in Romeo and Juliet, and you have the villain. And this is a picture of David Leonard, who played the villain for years and years in the pantomime York. So he's very well known in the city for this role. And here he is, the villainous, dreaded Lurgy. And if you have time, it is worth looking up the names that they gave this character. So it seems in a way ideal that David Leonard is cast as Richard III in a production a lot earlier than this photograph, which is this is later 2014, but the production was in the early 1990s, and it was part of a Wars of the Roses cycle. And I hate to say it, but in Yorkshire we're the white rose and Lancashire the red rose, and you still see that imagery all over. We pointed out to Imke the other day as she went into Lancashire back to the airport, there she passes the red rose. So that image is still around. Unfortunately, it wasn't as popular with the local critic. Now, I didn't realise that you would cover me up. So what I'm doing is I'm going to just read the bit that from the review that I can't see because we're covered over. But Charles Hutchinson, who's reviewed in the local paper for many, many times and would be very familiar with the pantomime, says, but the production lacks balance, not least because David Leonard is an actor where surface is all. Now think about as well the vice figure in the mystery plays, which is very surface as well, where surface is all, the arched eyebrows, the conspiratorial asides, even the trademark laugh of his celebrated Theatre Royal panto-villain are all here, and he finds an able straight foil in Martin Crocker's Buckingham, but there needs to be a greater sense of evil and resentment driving him on. This Richard III is highly theatrical, full of pageantry and black comedy, but lacks a poisonous cutting edge. So it's quite critical because, as Imke was talking about, we really have this kind of more depth in Shakespeare's actually Richard than we saw here. So the next production, and I don't need to know the date because I remember it very well, 1988, the Wars of the Roses, the English Shakespeare Company that travelled across England and the world, actually. And the thing was, to get all the plays in that Imke mentioned in her first talk, you had to play them across a weekend. And in 1988, when this production came to the York Theatre Royal, I was heavily pregnant with my son. So you can work out how long ago and how old my son is. And I had to sit there Friday night, all day Saturday and all day Sunday. But it's, again, often the Wars of the Roses are played in such a way, and then we see Andrew Jarvis, there's a more kind of modern dressed Richard, in a way that they start with early costume, Renaissance costume, and move through time and end up with Richard III in a modern dress. That's quite common. That happens quite a lot. And then I wanted just to mention briefly a production where Professor Judith Buchanan, who's now at Oxford University, wrote, which is based on a silent film version of Frank Benson playing Richard III. And what she did was she wrote a script for the silent film. The actors stood behind the audience in the dress circle and they spoke the parts across the silent film. And that was produced in York Theatre Royal and again in Richmond Castle. So that was an interesting way of going back to silent film and adding that extra layer of speech onto it. And the one I didn't see of all the projects I'm talking about, they built a replica Globe or Rose Theatre in York. It was going to be there forever, but unfortunately their tactics were a bit awry. When you put on Shakespeare's most popular plays in the very first season, you really haven't got a lot to keep going with. I'd go and see King John lots of times, and I know Імке and Natalia would go and see Assembly and Pericles, but that's not going to draw a tourist crowd in York. So here's Diffendy for as Richard III in the Rose Theatre, which unfortunately has now gone. 2 years it lasted. So I'm now going to talk briefly about some of the productions that have taken place, famous productions at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and some of the things that the actors thought about. So my first production that I ever saw at the Royal Shakespeare Company in 1984 was Anthony Sher. And the great thing about Anthony Sher was the way he used his costume. And I've just got a quote on the screen from Rupert Gould, who was looking back. He's a director that's directed many plays at the Royal Shakespeare Company recently. He's a lot younger than Anthony Sher, but he talks about seeing this production at school, and he talks about the way that Anthony Sher uses his costume to give the impression that he's the bottle spider that we hear him called in the text itself. And it was quite a feat for Anthony Sher to play this. He played this character on crutches, and you can see the picture there with the drapes from the costume looking like they're extra legs. And while we've also got a quote from Anthony Sher's book, The Year of the King, which talks about this particular production. It's a brilliant book. It's still in print in England, so it's worth a read if you can get hold of it. And he talks about now is the winter, just as Імке was saying. God, it seems terribly unfair of Shakespeare to begin his play with such a famous speech. You don't like to put your mouth to it. So many other mouths have been there. Or to be more honest, one particularly distinctive mouth. And here he's referring to Laurence Olivier, whose famous production lived in the memory and kind of haunted Anthony Sher as he was working towards this part. So he's talking about Olivier here. His poised staccato deliveries imprinted on those words like teeth marks. I sit in shock in the middle of the night, staring at the text. Now is the winter. And he's also kind of reminding us, when we know the text very, very well, how discombobulating, I shouldn't even try saying that word, I can't say it, but how disconcerting that it is when the audience know the text as well and they start kind of singing or speaking along beside you. It can be quite awkward. And I just love that first line and the way that Anthony Sher now says it on All Richard. There's a sense of that this minute I say now, this play will start. It's like switching the play on, like switching a light and the play starts. And it's a very, very kind of strong beginning. And the one thing that I loved about Anthony Sher, and I can't act it out for you unfortunately now because I'm on a screen. I would love to, but I can't because you'd just see my hands waving around, which they are now anyway. But the stage at Stratford at the time was a very steep apron stage. It was a proscenium arch theatre, like a cinema screen. And he had to kind of walk down this stage. He could have slipped and fallen really easily. And at the point he says the G of Edward's airs, he brings the crutches out from behind his back, so they become like another pair of legs. And in the air, he uses his crutches to write the G. And we all can see the irony of the Duke of Gloucester drawing the G in the air. But it's a really memorable moment. And I just wanted to just quickly say, because Imke talked about the Lady Anne scene, what was really interesting here is Anthony Sher talks about Penny Downey, who was his Lady Anne, that they got on so well. He wouldn't have done this if they hadn't got a rapport together. But at the point he's speaking to her, at one point, he gets the crutch and lifts her skirt up with it, which is very phallic and very terrifying and quite an ugly thing to do. And I've never actually seen another Richard do anything like that, but these crutches became the props to signify his body, his agility, but also the way he was seducing Lady Anne in that very awkward, gross way that he does, and the way she succumbs as well, because she has no other way out. At the end of the play, the ghosts have all come to Richard, Anthony Sher, and he's killed by Richmond, who we can see in this shot, with the sword down the back of his hunchback. But fortunately, it's a prop hunchback, so there's no injury to Anthony Sher playing Richard III. And you can actually see the hunchback in some exhibitions, and there's a slit in the back where the sword goes in. Fortunately, the Richmond didn't miss that. Now, this is Simon Russell Beale as Richard III at the start of his career. Again, early 90s, this one. He played this part in a small space in Stratford-on-Avon. Then it toured the country in sports halls and everything. And I was lucky to see this production in the sports hall in Doncaster, where the wings were between the seats. So before he came on to give a speech or anything like that, he might just look at you and catch your eye and say, hello, which was very seductive. If you know Simon Russell Beale, he can be extremely seductive as an actor. And he, in his Was Ever Woman in This Humour, woot, Was Ever Woman in This Humour one, was a very playful moment where he's directing to the audience to ask the audience, do you agree with me? And you could probably tell from the photograph that I've got here, he was the bunchback toad. His kind of image as Richard throughout the production was as the toad that kind of bumbled through, quite terrifying as well. I want to talk quickly about Barry Rutter, who's Richard III, was performed in a Yorkshire accent. And that's quite important because often in Great Britain, all Shakespeare is performed in received pronunciation. It's kind of the language of the upper classes. It's the language of the Queen and royalty, the dukes. And it's frowned upon often to use regional accents when speaking Shakespeare. But Barry Rutter decided that he would change things, and he started to play all the parts of Shakespeare in the regional accent. But here's some of the things that some of the critics said. Irving Wardle loved it. Some extraordinary things he wrote happen in the lines as Elizabethan English comes into Yorkshire close up. And if you want to know what a Yorkshire accent sounds like, you're hearing it now, because I've got a lovely broad Yorkshire accent. But John Peter Witherley dismissed it as karaoke theatre. And the Evening Standard Cricket said, Rutter's efforts put regional actors back where they began as comic relief. So we still see that snobbering, we still see it today, where the idea is if you're playing working class or you're playing one of the comic roles, then you play it in a regional accent. You kind of put in your place, and it really is insulting in this day and age. And so what this company, Northern Broadsides, with Barry Rutter, are trying to do is get away from the idea that if you've got a regional accent, you speak like being a Yorkshire accent, you can actually play the better parts, or you can be a lecturer on Shakespeare. You're not just the comic relief for other people. And just the final quote from the Daily Telegraph. I confess, I thought it sounded dotty, but the weird thing, it works. Shakespeare sounds terrific in authentic northern voices. The flattened vowels, dropped aspirates, and use of words like out and e give the language a real immediacy and speed. And I love that because my son runs a theatre company called Say Out. So that kind of chimes really well with me. So I'm just going to talk about, you may have seen this, Ian McKellen's Richard-III. This is a picture from the opening soliloquy in the film, but this was actually a theatre production before it came a film. And what I find really interesting is that opening soliloquy starts out in the public space but moves into the private space. So that change, talking to like everybody to the eye, happens in the men's toilet here. And here is Ian McKell's Richard kind of caught in himself in the mirror, in the looking glass. So actually he's saying one thing, but his actions mean something else. And the production kind of based some of its ideas on ideas of fascism, and it kind of played around with narcissism, the kind of fascism in Germany, Hitler's fascism, and also with English fascism before the Second World War, where there was a rise of fascist ideas, the black shirts, and Oswald Mosley had a kind of brief moment where he got some kind of popularity in London particularly. So these ideas, and you can see by the use of the colours and the imagery, the boar on the flag, that it's reminiscent of a period in history which was quite terrifying. And one of the things that Richard Eyre talks about, and I have actually got the quote heightened, is that yes, the stage play itself, the imagery, the staging was particularly based on these ideas of fascism and the rise of fascism. What also interested Richard Eyre was this idea of the dictator, wherever the dictator is, and where people suffer when there's a dictatorship. And he talks to the writer of this article, Jamie Rogers, and in a private conversation, which obviously is given permission to be published, that he'd seen the suffering at the end of the 1980s in Bucharest, Romania, and he had a lot of that in mind. When you've got Richard, a dictator, rise to power, how the ordinary people, how the citizens of that country are suffering. And that was particularly an idea that was being explored in the stage production and into the film. And there is another layer on that production that Jamie Rogers talks about, and that is Thatcherism at the end of the 90s. And again, a nationalist surgeons with the National Front, the jingoistic language around when they sent an armada to release the Falkland Islands from Argentina. It's like right across the world. And there was all this jingoistic, were so great, etc. And I think that that's important, that production particularly had that layer running through it as well. And I just finally want to finish on a production that I particularly liked, as Імке knows. Імke saw this production as well. And this is John Joe O'Neill as Richard III and Pippa Nixon as Lady Anne. And what I find particularly interesting is we've got a very young Richard. We've got quite a charismatic Richard in the actor that's playing Richard III. He's also using his regional accent, the Northern Irish accent. So again, taking this back maybe to more of the roots of the way that Shakespeare was spoken in the Renaissance, in Shakespeare's day, than how it is spoken on the British stage nowadays. And what's interesting in particular scene, it's a very private scene, you would think, from reading it where he's seducing her. But actually it could be observed by the pallbearers who in this production are standing at the back. Do they step forward? Do they intervene? And that's something to think about when considering how you might particularly stage the production. So this is a video, but I can't actually make it work at the moment, but it's a really interesting example of the very first scene. But I think Імke did a much better job. So I think we don't need to see John Joe doing it at this particular moment, but he's constantly toying with the audience. You can see one of the critics called him Robbie Williams, doing That's Entertainment, the entertainer. I particularly thought that worked really well, but when I spoke to the actor John Joe O'Neill, he didn't quite like that that description of him playing the role. But he's very, very kind of coming right up to the audience in a small Swan Theatre space, more or less in the kind of looking each member of the audience directly in the eye, which I think works really well when you want to give the idea of the seductive villain. And the other thing on what was ever woman in this humour would, was ever woman in this humour would, which is Simon Russell Beale's version, not John Joe O'Neill's version. But John Joe O'Neill, when he said those lines, he kind of directed them directly to a member of the audience. And somebody in the audience once said, yes. And he went, she says yes, which is, again, that audience participation, ad-libbing. So I've just got this one quote to finish with, and I just have to read it off only because you're all over the other side of it and I can't read it. So, right. So here we go. This is Carol Rutter, who I was quoting earlier, writing about Barry Rutter. And she's a very important critic in Britain and across the world. And she wrote reviews in the Cambridge Shakespeare Survey every year for quite some time, and they were really important. She says, O'Neill's silly Richard was headed for detention, not damnation. An insolent, overgrown schoolboy with a tinting quiff, which I can agree with that, and a grinning face you wanted to slap, who played for cheap laughs, and many of them solicited from the stalls. You're going to love this, he joked, with the front row partway through the opening soliloquy. Later, after plots have I laid, a double taking with the audience to add, oh yeah, and with a grin showing rotten teeth, too many trips to the tuck shop. I was not amused, but then I'm never amused by actors who think they're cleverer than Shakespeare or who have so little professional discipline that they leave the play to indulge their own meagre personalities. I wanted this Richard frog marched off to the headmaster's office and left there. Note to the incoming RSI directorate. So it was just at the moment Gregory Doran was taking over from Michael Boyd at the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford. Just a note, please can you look at the bad actor habits that have become rife in the company over the past decade, starting with the ad-libs, and get rid of them. You can use O'Neill as a case study. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening to me and inviting me to come and talk to you in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Julie, and I do believe that everyone enjoyed both presentations very much, and we discovered a lot of new facts, new ideas from these presentations. For example, as for me, I was greatly impressed with the accent on the language aspect in pronunciation or in reproduction, Richard-III in contemporary England. It was very interesting to learn. Moreover, I enjoyed much the picture when Anthony Sher reminds us Kafka's heroes. It was really very, very impressive to watch and to learn about these tendencies. And I suppose that we have some questions to both speakers, and you're welcome to raise a hand or to maybe write it in our chat. I'd like to ask Imke, first of all, and then probably one question to Julie, and then Maxim, and then Irina, and some other persons who would like to join us. So, for many years, I have been thinking about Richard III as an extraordinary personality, and I asked myself why Richard III is so attractive as a literary character for us. Villain, tyrant, murderer of his close relatives, faithless traitor, manipulator, but at the same time, I can't but understand him a little bit as a woman, as a mother, and I feel a kind of compassion to him as an ugly, deformed person who has been or had been suffering much since his childhood. So I've got ambivalent feelings to this person while reading the text. And my question to Imke is the following. Which of the strategies Richard III uses to draw the audience into this bloody character, which of these strategies are the most effective when we read, and which are the strategies when we see him on the theater stage or on the screen?
Thank you, Natalia, for that question, which is giant. I think there's so many different parts that you can answer there. And a couple of thoughts come to my mind, so I will go through some of them. I think one of them is this concept of kalokagatia, which is a Greek word, and it means that whatever is good is beautiful. And of course, it's something that people are working with, the idea that sometimes, oh, he's such a nice boy, let's give him an A star. And it's something that in a way is despised. It's used by everybody, and it's to a certain extent, I suppose, part of capitalism or in the Baudrillard sense, looks are capital. But it's also so very unfair, this idea that if somebody is beautiful, then they are good. So I think we are with the underdog who is treated as ugly and therefore villainous, and then we go, well then, okay, go and do your thing because you are being treated unfair. And of course, I'm coming to a second concept there, which is being discussed now as far as casting is concerned, and that is disability studies and the idea of how to bring in equity and what a way to demand his own equity, to really reach for the stars and finally get them. So this aspect of if you are disabled, then you can go for it nevertheless, and the idea of success, which is again a different aspect that we might admire. Another point that I can find absolutely convincing is that of the romantic, brooding, dark villain, Heathcliff or mad bad Byron, that comes in, this idea of the brooding and possibly villainous character being as such the attractive one. And the fourth point that comes to my mind is where Julie started us off from. It's the vice figure and the idea of, well, how else should we get something exciting to happen but without vice? And I suppose none of these are truly convincing, but all of those I would bring in as points to start thinking about. Thank you for that question.
Thank you very much for your answer. Yesterday, we discussed this problem with our yesterday's speakers, and with our audience. And one of the most burning points was what is our attitude to the ugliness, to the evil, and how do these two concepts, ugliness and inner evil in the personality, how do they coincide? And thank you very much for the idea of kalakagatia. Yesterday we didn't mention this interesting term and didn't mention Aristotle, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, it's his term, kalakagatia, or it's from ancient Greeks when they think about the correlation between good and evil and correlation between appearance and the inner world. Thank you very much for this idea. And I think that if there are any students in our virtual hall, it will be very interesting for them to look at the protagonist of these Shakespeare historical chronicles through the prism or through the lens of disability studies. Disability studies are not, unfortunately, are not well known in Ukrainian literary studies. They are only making their first steps, and probably there is an interesting perspective in this aspect. So thank you very much, Імке, and thank you for this inspiration. We will try to think about it. And the next question, then I probably would like to ask some questions to Julie, but maybe a little bit later, because I see that there are some hands. So Maxim.
Okay, so I'm very grateful to both Імке and Julie for such a wonderful and cohesive lecture, and actually have questions for both speakers. And my first question is for Імке. So I'm very interested in the rhetoric of Richard III, because it seems to me that the strategies of this bloody king, of this horrifying creature, offer important insights into the nature of tyranny, manipulation, propaganda, and actually mass deception. So in your opinion, which linguistic and rhetoric devices have the strongest effect on us as an audience, and ultimately on the characters within the play themselves, such as Lady Anne, for example?
Thank you, Maxim, for that question. I find it really difficult to answer that because I'm not quite sure myself. But I think it's this idea of really using sentence structures and taking up most of those points that the person before, like Lady Anne, used, but then just slightly altering them and therefore bringing out a completely different meaning. So the idea of, you just used the word manipulation, and I think it's that. Manipulate slight words. There's only one room where I can see you. Hell or prison is what Lady Anne thinks. And he says, yes, there's only one room that I can see more myself as well. So in a certain way agreeing, but then turning it around, your bedchamber. Daria Moskvitina, I saw you on the slides there, on the tiles there as well. As a translator, I suppose you would have really good opinions on that as well. So working with the syntax, I suppose, is one of the strong points. So linguistic versatility, but which figures of speech exactly? Let me think a little more about that. But I think it's this idea of repeating, repetition, but slight alterations that I would go for, and then exchanging choices of words. Thank you. Difficult question as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I also have a question for Julie. So actually yesterday, again, as Natalia Turkut mentioned before, we were trying to discuss yesterday during the first session on Richard. And so evil is very often portrayed as grotesque or ridiculous. Dictators and tyrants are frequently depicted as repulsive and small, for example. And in Richard III, actually Shakespeare presents Richard as physically deformed, yet as you have just shown, in some productions he also appears charismatic and really attractive, as evil itself sometimes can be. In your opinion, how do directors manage to reach the audience and evoke the sense of disgust toward Richard that Shakespeare initially intended, while at the same time portraying him as both monstrous and strangely appealing in certain performances?
Oh, that's such a good question, and it's one that Imke and I have been talking about quite a lot. I think that we're kind of taken along with Richard because the humour right from the start, where we know he's the G of Edward Sayres, because he tells us he's the G of Edward Sayres, and then he's setting up Clarence to be the one that's killed because his name's George, a Duke of Clarence. So there's a kind of we're in on the trickery from the start. We're in on it. He tells us right from the start, so we're implicitly involved. If you see what I mean in that. I think it's when he murders the princes in the tower that he really has kind of switched, and there's no way back. Like there's a point where Faustus, he knows there's no way back. And I think with Richard, often in performance, it's at that moment where he's shunning Buckingham. He's become king, but it's not enough. It's like many of Shakespeare's characters. They get what they want, but that is never enough. They just want more and more. And I think because a lot of the imagery kind of plays on that black humour up to that point. We saw that, didn't we, in the Romanian production where he's feeding the little princes sweets all the time, and we were laughing. Or the one we saw in Germany where, come to the tower, it's nice in the tower, like that kind of seductive figure from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, the children capturer. In the Roxana Silva, directed with John Joe O'Neill, I think we're kind of going along with this kind of black humour comedy moment to the very moment where the coffins of the children are on the stage, or the memorials, and Richard comes on with his entourage with two little teddy bears and puts the two little teddy bears down in front of the mother of the princes who have been killed, and all the women in the play. And I just think, oh, you've gone too far. That is not the black hue. That is not funny anymore. I can't laugh at that. That is just terrible. And I suppose you've got Margaret as well. And I'm not quite sure. Do we laugh at the fact he kind of sends the curse to Margaret? What's she doing there? Why is she still wandering around that castle? So I think we're kind of wanting him to get on to that very point. And I hope that helps answer the question. That's just my opinion, really. that it's that point where we know he's just taking it just that too far.
Thank you.
And the Buckingham,
Thank you.
yes.
Thank
I'm
you very
not in the giving vein, he says, and it's like, go away now.
Thank you very
Thank
much. Ірина, Безродних, your question?
Thank you very
Or
much. Thank you
questions?
for your brilliant lectures. I have a question dealing more with the seduction in the play, with the desire. You know, you mentioned, so the first one is to Імке. Yeah, I'm interested in the topic, in fact. So, as for seduction, it's not only, so he manages to seduce Anne, but he also tries to use like the same strategy with Elizabeth, with Queen Elizabeth later, and who knows, then the winner gets the prize, let's say, in the end, but who knows, so perhaps the result would also be quite good for him, And the question is, so what is the core, as for you, what is the core of his seduction, of Richard's seduction? Is it persuasion? Is it performance? Is it theatrical desire? You know, how does he manage to do it? And thus also the question to Julie, if I may, how do the stagings construct this seduction and desire? You know, how do they manage to demonstrate it?
Really intricate question. Thank you so much for that. I think it's fascinating, and I suppose that Julie and I might have similar answers, but they are so very different because we already have the positive effect of his workings towards his means in the text. He is successful in the text, so it must be somehow there in the text. And then Julie's part, I suppose, is the idea of, how is this done on stage? And I don't think it's a true idea of convincing, but it's exactly as you said, this idea of persuasion. So the idea of he doesn't really convince with his arguments, but he persuades with his arguments. So that I suppose the idea of linguistic prowess, as I mentioned, leaves Lady Anne with no words, with such versatility as far as ensnarement is concerned, that basically she just has to shut up. And realize there's nothing else to say, and therefore I have lost the game of text, or possibly even just standing there at the end thinking, how did he do this? I don't even know how he did it, but he did it. She has the physical ability to kill him. He gave her his knife or his sword, but she can't do it because he still continues talking. So it must be in the words. And yet, of course, it's and that's where you started. It's this idea of that making him, at least for us, so really attractive. So the idea of us as an audience being fascinated and that we admire this versatility and prowess. This idea of, I wish I could do that too. The idea of, look, he's successful with his devious creations, and that even though he looks like this, at least in Shakespeare and in more, but possibly even because of that, because each of us, I'm just rambling now, but maybe it's also the idea that a lot of us have this imposter syndrome, and he is the perfect imposter. Maybe it's that. I have just a rambling answer, and I have lots of ideas there, but I don't have a definite answer. And I think it depends also on how the line is said, and then to pass the question on to Julie and as to how it's produced. Thank you so much. I'm going to think more about that one though.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Імке. Thank you. Julie, you're welcome.
I think that's such a good question, because once you've kind of seen that scene and you start to think about, you see it a lot in film. I can't think of any examples straight away, but film and soap opera, the similar kind of thing. Well, the first thing is she's grieving. So her emotions are absolutely all over the place. We can't kind of know how that feels and how that can be contained. And she's seen quite a few family members being murdered by this person. So there's that kind of mix of hatred. And she says, you know, you're a lump of foul deformity. And it's like trying to think of the worst things you can say to somebody. So it's not always necessary that Richard is that. A lot of the things he's called are people who are trying to find language to describe how they feel they see him rather than he may look like that. So the first thing I would say is the grieving. The fact that there's a coffin on stage and this is being played over the coffin, I think that's kind of works. I think sometimes when you see scenes in film, television, on stage, where there is that grief moment, you do see characters actually succumb to somebody because of the very situation they're in. I can't think of an example. I mean, I can think of a really good example from a soap opera, but in England, but I don't think you'll know it. But this kind of way of, in grief, these things can happen. We've also got the phallic sword that gets pushed through, you know, from one to the other. The spitting in the face is another thing. The shock, but how dare they do that? And I would say the other one is the difference between when you're so angry you would kill in the moment. And I don't know as a mother how, you know, if anybody came near my son when he was a baby, I had that feeling that you never get anywhere else. If somebody actually goes to them, as a mother, you feel that moment of where you could do it and you could grab hold of them, or if you had a knife. But because she's actually had that pause, that moment which we see, she's no longer in that heightened state. It's the difference between do it now and then giving her time to think about it. She can't. And that is, I think, the way they play that on stage. You know, you could have killed him, but now you're giving her time to think about it, time to let that go through your mind, that she can no longer do that at that moment. So, yeah, I think it does really depend. And I think the seduction, the other thing I was going to say, which is a bit shallow, but it's one of the things when you go to the theatre, they're often casting the most handsome men as Richard III as well. So I didn't talk about Ray Fiennes, who played him recently. There's a array. I mean, even John Job was Mercutio. He was the darling of that season in Stratford-on-Avon. So, you know, that's another thing where it's often the Water the Roses at the Richmond Theatre. The guy was quite a famous actor from a television. He you know, you're casting an actor that's got that particular set of tools in their trade. Particularly our German Richard III, he was very attractive, wasn't he? Even though he was so ugly in the way he dressed. But it's that idea the ugly can be beautiful. Yeah. Sorry, I'm rambling now.
Thank
I do
you.
that now.
Thank you very much. And I like to ask my question to you. So my question is the following. Yesterday we discussed the productions of Richard III made by the Soviet theater directors in Ukraine and contemporary directors. And as it was mentioned yesterday, the famous Georgian director Robert Sturua used such a specific strategy in his representation of Richard III as the breaking of the fourth wall. When, for example, after this scene with Lady Anne, he appealed to the audience, to the spectators, and boasted. Yeah. So, in such a way, by making us, the audience, the keeper of his secrets, Richard III ensures that we cannot judge him from a distance. Our silence makes us his co-conspirators, probably. And we also can speak about seduction or temptation. We are also the part of this game. So my question is, do the British directors, or maybe those world-known directors whom you mentioned, use this theatrical approach, breaking of the fourth wall in Richard III?
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely fantastic. Particularly in Richard III, that is one of the reasons that particular role is so attractive. That you are talking directly to the audience. You've not got anything kind of around it. Richard's coming straight on the stage. You're talking directly to the audience. Depending on the playing space, it could actually be directing to you sat there in the audience yourself. So the breaking of the fourth wall in Richard III in British productions is very, very common. And I think that's why actors like to play it, because they have that rapport going with the audience, and that is part of what's going on. I mean, the particular production, Roxana Silber in The Swan, 2012, there were some naughty schoolboys in the front row one night, and they were obviously annoying the actors. So when they cut Hastings' head off, they came on with this paper mache head, but they were kind of holding it over these schoolboys and teasing these schoolboys and kind of getting and basically saying to them, we know what you're laughing, but actually we can get you back with this head. And they were like, oh my God, this could be you the next scene. So yeah, that interaction and the breaking of the fourth wall. But I will add, I did read the Carol Rutter at the end, which is kind of ironic. There is a skepticism over that. I mean, some critics and academics really don't like that kind of interaction with the audience. Things like getting audience members on stage and to become part of the production. They really frown on that kind of thing. They really want that distance between you and the stage. I mean, I'm very happy to get on stage and be part of a production, but I know that is something that's kind of not really supposed to happen in British theatres. Yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julie. And we have a lot of information and maybe some questions in our chat. So some people would like to greet all of us. Department of Performing Arts and Culture of Kyiv National University is pleased to be here. Theatrical Department of Ivan Kotlarevsky, Kharkiv National University. Thank you very much for being with us. We know how difficult it is to live in Kyiv and in Kharkiv. Then, hello everyone, warm greetings from Poltava National Pedagogical University. Then Natalia Kranitska writes, Dear Imke and Julie, thank you for your brilliant lectures. And then I see that Natalia has put some two questions. Natalia, are you with us?
Yeah. Hello everyone. Hello, dear Imke, dear Julie. Thanks a lot. You are great. Thank you. It's wonderful. Actually, I have two questions to Julie as for Air's production.
Yeah.
And maybe somehow I have missed it, but I have two questions about 2 points. First of all, the ghosts, their appearance in this Air's production. Is it possible to combine the surrealism of their appearance with the ideology of bureaucratic fascism presented in this play? So maybe you remember how it was done. And the second point is about Richmond, who is actually like Henry VII, yeah, and who is, again, as for his role in Ayer's production, is he like a savior or the next military leader who wants to control everyone?
Yeah. I mean, they're really good questions. Ayer's production was about, I saw it on stage, but I was trying to think about how the ghost worked on the actual stage. And to be honest, I can't at the moment. I would have to.
Oh, okay, thank
I
you.
do
Sorry.
remember. Yeah, no, it's absolutely fine. But I do remember at the end of the film where where the actual horse was a massive tank. And it was basically Battersea Power Station. And I think that point about Richmond, who the peevish boy, that's one of my favourite lines, Richmond the peevish boy, because he's heard somebody say in one of the earlier plays that he's going to take over. He's always in the background of Richard III. And you often get Richmond at the end with the crown, takes the crown off the dead Richard, and then the whole stage lights up as if the sun's in the background. And we've kind of got this idea that it all's going to be well because he's going to marry, the two houses will be united and everything will be fine. But I think there's also that sense that this is a cycle that history may keep repeating. And I always have that feeling that we don't quite know enough about Richmond, or whether everything will be, it might become just like we see productions of Macbeth now where we're not satisfied that the ending has got rid of the tyrant, that actually that can still be going on, which I think, again, and I think history showed that Henry VII was quite a strict king as well, though Shakespeare's not writing history in this at all. But I think they're really good questions. I think productions nowadays leave that doubt. It's a bit like the end of Measure for Measure. Does Isabella marry the Duke? Well, in modern productions, often no, but the text suggests they do. And I think in Richard III, the text suggests, the sun's risen again, but we started with that, didn't we? That image. Everything's going to be fine. The two sides have reunited, but we've heard it all before. So I think modern productions do tend to leave that glimmer of doubt. I don't know if Imke's got any anything to add to that.
I was thinking about the second question that you were asking, Natalia, and the idea of Richmond, basically, and the role that he plays as a figure. He only comes in slightly before the end, so he does actually not feel like a proper protagonist, and as such, or not a proper antagonist. It's not as if two people are set up as being big figures, but Richard is the hero, the protagonist, the title character of the play, and Richmond just comes in at the end, which I mentioned, almost like a deus ex machina, to save the world and to somehow prepare for the Tudor dynasty. And as such, of course, yes, he is as this kind of god, a savior figure, but he's this very pale figure in contrast to Richard. We don't get to know much of him, and the role he plays. Plus, though, even then, it depends, of course, on how he's performed. And Julie will know this better, but I think it was the Histories cycle when Henry VII came in with his troops at the end of one production, and they all had military instruments and their machine guns, and it was just a question of, okay, here's another tyrant, possibly nascent, to take over, which of course I'm pretty sure wouldn't have been the way that early modern productions would have done it. Thank you.
Thank you
we
so
see that
much.
in Hamlet as well, don't we? Yeah, that kind of idea that actually that country's doomed because it's the conqueror that's coming in.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, the ambiguity is brilliant with Shakespeare. You can do a lot with it.
Yeah. Thank you both. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, dear colleagues, and some remarks in our chat. Юлія Вишницька, professor from Kyiv, Boris Grimchenko University. Dear Imke, dear Julie, thank you for this celebration of words and voices. Your performances are extremely bright, artistic, and dynamic. Shakespeare comes to life in your voices, intonations, rhythm. We have a siren, but today we have a kind of peace day in accordance with Putin's promises. Thank you for the pleasure of hearing such Shakespeare. Then Diana Wolfke, a huge thank you to the wonderful lecturers. It was a pleasure to listen to your insightful reflections, gain new perspectives on the topic, and hear more from such brilliant, I'm sorry, I suppose that from such brilliant speakers, something like people. Thank you. And we have a question from Leila Bugrova, Zaporizhia. Leila, are you with us?
Yes, I'm terribly sorry. Zoom seems to be a bit clunky today. And yeah, I'm terribly sorry if my question is a bit scattered or all over the place. I'll try to make it as brief as possible. First of all, I can't believe I got to listen to all that for free. That was absolutely amazing. Thank you so very much for this incredible pleasure of just being present. It's been incredible. But also, I've got kind of a follow-up question to Professor Talcott's question about the fourth wall break, which kind of appeared, I suppose it would be a question to the both of you, Imke and Julie, because I would just love to hear your personal opinions on the point. This question kind of appeared while I've read and heard about that kind of critical piece of feedback that a certain, I guess, a theatre critic, right? Sorry, didn't remember the name exactly, but a certain theatre critic gave some quite, I would say, well, scolding piece of feedback to a certain actor who kind of tried to put their own spin on Richard III by being a bit too playful with the audience. And it kind of appeared to me, it seems like canonically Richard seems to be a person who, a character who interacts quite directly with the audience in a sort of a playful manner. And I think, well, to my very humbly personal opinion, this spin that the actor might have put on the character while interacting with the audience seems to be quite in line with the character. But I would like, and as far as I understand, it's just kind of generally frowned upon in the British theatre scene. But I would like to hear your opinions. Do you think a Richard who is playful and breaks the fourth wall with the audience is a Richard failed, a Richard improved, or just a Richard? Thank you.
Julie, I think you have more on this, so I'm just going to go first and very, very quickly give you some of my thoughts there. Thank you very much, Laila, for that question. I love it because I love the collaboration with the audience. It of course depends on the theatre. If you've got a large stage with a proscenium arch and you're sitting in category 5 and can't much be part of that, it might leave you with a very different opinion. But I love the idea of especially the set, for example, at the Globe, where the stage is right in its middle and the actors can collaborate with the audience. The idea of getting them in, and to me, I'm going to lean towards the improved, together with a couple of other characters that directly spring to my mind, which are the bastards in, for example, King Lear or King John, who both also let us be part of their plans, especially Edmund in King Lear, and allows us to share in the joy of being a little devious here. But Julie.
Yeah, well, I think that's the joy of performance. I think the fact that you're going to see different versions, and hopefully if I'm going to see a version of Richard III, I don't want to see something that a vision of the play that I could have got from reading myself. I want to go and see somebody else's interpretation. And I think that's the way that Shakespeare studies is kind of changing from maybe the 1960s, 70s kind of critical. There was a big debate by two scholars. One said, you know, it shouldn't be talking about all these productions, it should just be going to the text. And you know, coming out of literature rather than out of performance studies, this sense of, you know, stick to the text, don't be using performance as examples. And I think this is the way that actually, particularly in Europe, the approach to Shakespeare through performance, which I've just been introduced to very recently through the Natalia and Імке and all the work you're doing, is kind of I don't know, I would say two different strands because they do mix a lot, but there is a sense, going back to Hassler and Lamb, that they wanted to see a production of Shakespeare that they couldn't read and put their own they wanted to see something different, and if it was a bad production, they weren't interested in that. So I love the idea of being able to see performances that are totally different, that the actors do new things with all the time. And so I would say improve, if that's certainly improve that dialogue with the audience. And don't we love it? If, you know, we're at the theatre and, you know, I'm trying to think of, well, you know, say David Tennant's playing Benedict at Much Ado and he directs a line directly at you. I'm happy with that, I think. I'm happy with the breaking of the fourth wall. That's what it's exciting. I mean, you know, when you come out of the theatre and you're buzzing with it because you've just been involved in it. But yeah, there is a certain tradition, and I think with American scholars as well, in British criticism, that actually it's about finding meaning in the text and not through the performance itself. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Імке, or...
That's brilliant. I agree with Julie. I agree with Julie. I mean, we've had the Brechtian tradition throughout the 20th century, but we can see that it's been there as well. And of course, I think what Julie just highlighted, the idea of we are being involved. And this experience makes us not just spectators, but I think Natalia said a moment ago, co-conspirators, and that is just so very enjoyable. And be it co-mourners as well with Lady N, if she lets us in, or somebody else is grieving. Howl, 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 King Lear. Being involved and being part of the pathos as well of the plays. Thanks.
Thank you ever so much. It's a great relief to hear that you also have such a positive feedback to that kind of approach. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry, Professor Torkut, we cannot hear you. I think your microphone is off.
Sorry, thank you very much for the question and for brilliant answers. Well, and Daria Moskvitina. Daria, you're welcome. Dasha, microphone.
Very much. Yeah, there is something wrong with my Zoom. If I may, I could just make a sort of addition. Maybe you know, maybe not. Maybe I'm sure that you know, but maybe someone doesn't. That in Jasper Forder's The Air Affair, he describes a very interesting performance of Richard III, when not only Richard interacts with the audience, but the audience interacts with Richard. So it's like made glorious summer by the son of York, and everyone puts on sunglasses and things like that. That's a really funny thing to read about. But my question will be the following. It may sound a bit cheesy, just never mind that. So actually, we know that Richard, apart from everything else, he's a bullshit factory. So he says, I'm not very good for sportive tricks, I'm not lover,
Yes,
so I will
yes.
be a villain, blah, blah, blah. But just three or 4 or 5 pages pass, and he says that, okay, Lady Anna, I'm going to join you in your bedchamber.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah,
who's not a
absolutely.
lover here? Come on. And actually what he does during all kind of
Absolutely.
a bit subtly, of course, it is not brought on stage, maybe because it was just maybe I don't know, parental guidance or whatever. But actually, he had, like the Macbeth, actually, he had to produce an heir, yeah? Because otherwise, his royal power is nothing.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
failed. He apparently failed, though historically he didn't, at least for some time. But the question is, yes, taking into account his deformity and taking his readiness to join Lady Anne and then Elizabeth in their bedchambers, were there any productions that openly demonstrated that eroticism possible, again, taking into account his deformity? So it might have been simply very difficult for him to do the necessary intercourse to produce an heir. Were there any production that tried to explore this aspect of Richard's reign?
Oh,
Julie, you go on. I cannot think of any. In contrast, I can
No.
think of loads where exactly what you've just said is proven true. Where, for example, the Düsseldorf one we saw, he's playing with the deformity, but he has almost put the deformity itself on by putting on weird shoes that he can't walk in, or the idea of the real Richard actually having an heir, or the idea of this is teleological history and it needs to be seen like this because it's also Tudor historiography, not only by Shakespeare but by Thomas More as well, and just making up this deformity. So I can't think of one, Daria. Interesting question.
No.
Julie, what about
Yeah.
you? Can you think of one?
I mean, I think it's interesting that that would be offstage action and why and what you could do with that. But I can think the Anthony Sher one, I do remember when he was crowned, he had all the regalia, but he crawled up the stage to the throne where Lady Anne was sitting. So you got that kind of image of a man that wasn't even able to walk to his own coronation. He's like crawling like a ball up the stage, and that really emphasized their disability. But like everybody said today, you know, it's not necessarily that he has to be played with a disability. What it seems is actors take one thing or another thing. They pick from the text and then work with that. And certainly the production we saw in Dusseldorf, the putting off the clothes was like putting on the physical evilness. Yet that actor had, I mean, there were moments where you could see that he was in character, showing off a very buff body, and there was a lot of kind of the body was really important and how you dress that body. And it just reminded us what we've been writing about, that of fashion, like Alexander McQueen's fashion, where the models look really ugly. They're wearing like barbed wire or they're wearing masks, but actually that's seen as very beautiful as well. That kind of playing with the ugly is beautiful. And Imke's quote at the start kind of emphasised that very much. Yeah. So I hope that answers a little bit of the question.
Thank
But it
you
sounds
very
like
much.
you've got some great ideas, and Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And two more messages in our chat. Олександра Білецька writes, a heartfelt thank you to the amazing lecturers. It was truly inspiring to hear your thoughtful insights, explore new perspectives on the topic, and learn from the such knowledgeable people. And Svetlana Nikolaenko, cordial thanks for a marvelous lecture from Kyiv National Linguistic University. So thank you very much. And from the
Thank
bottom of
you.
my heart, I would like to express my warmest feelings to both speakers, and it'll be very wonderful and grateful if you agree to write a kind of paper or an article, maybe as co-authors, for our Renaissance Study, our journal, scholarly journal. We are working over, so we have already published, I can show it to you, 40 issues. We began to publish it in the previous century, in 1998. So it will be a great honor for us if you agree to write a paper dealing with Richard III as a text and Richard III as a performance, as a production, because this topic is not only inspiring for us. You see that nowadays we have to experience this terrible, ugly person whose name is Putin. And that's why the nature of evil is really a topical question for us. So it will be very interesting for our literary scholars, for our theater scholars, to get acquainted with your brilliant ideas, with your considerations. And I do believe that one day we will win in this terrible genocidal war, and will be able to invite both of you, my dearest friends, to come to Ukraine to participate in our, it will be the 8th International Shakespeare Conference in Ukraine, or maybe to be present, to be the guest of our 3rd International Shakespeare Festival in Ivano-Frankivsk next year, in 2027, and it will be a great honor for us. And if you don't mind, we would go on our communication dealing with publishing your paper and listening to you during our next events this year and maybe next year and in future. So thank you very much. So we decided to return our recording, and here we can see Sergei Vinichenko, who is a theater analyst and who is the creator of theater blog that is called Theater Fishing. And on this blog we have a unique opportunity to learn a lot about Shakespeare performances in Ukraine. Nowadays Sergei is in the war zone. I don't get permission to tell you the place, but he has a code name that is Shakespeare. So, Shakespeare, the floor is yours.
Пані Наталя, дуже дякую за таке представлення. Я трішечки, можливо, можу привідкрити локацію, тим паче, що я тут зупинився, я підключився, я не чув, на жаль, лекцію, я зміг підключитися на питання.
Так, Сергій, не так багато слів, ми ж не встигаємо перекласти. So, Sergei mentions that unfortunately he didn't have an opportunity to listen to these brilliant lectures since the very beginning because he's in the front line now. But, але, і так не спочатку, але...
Просто я не знаю, що вам буде видно, але давайте спробуємо.
Ми бачимо все, ми бачимо твоє обличчя з бородою і бачимо локацію.
Моє обличчя. А ви бачите прапор? Прапор ви бачите України?
If you see the flag, yes, we see the flag.
Yes.
Yes.
Значить, це така локація, де можна було б так великою сценою зіграти Річарда. Це Харків, Харків – це Україна.
It's a peculiar location where we can stage Richard-III now. It is
Тут,
Kharkiv.
звісно, Харків – це не територія королівства, хіба що таке
Kharkiv is not a
герцогство.
kingdom territory, but не територія королівства.
Герцогство. Герцогство.
Duke, we can say about dukedom, not kingdom.
Тут є свої сіді графи.
It's only for Ukrainians quite clear that
І
here
такі
in
різні.
Kharkiv we have the person who is called Grey Earl or Duke. It is the mayor of Kharkiv, whose name is Igor Terechov, the main person in Kharkiv, and it's not pseudonym, it's not code name, but people metaphorically called him Grey Сідий граф, да?
Earl Grey.
Earl Grey, yeah. Earl Grey.
Yes.
Тобто, в принципі, на цих теренах можна було щось би таке великої сцени поставити. Але завтра ми будемо говорити не про харківського Річарда, про нього згадувала пані Юлія Щукіна вчора. А завтра ми поговоримо...
Не поспішай. So, I'd like to translate for Julie and for Imke that yesterday we talked much about Ukrainian Richards, and Yulia Shukina, who is from Kharkiv. He told us a lot about the performances in the Soviet Ukraine and in contemporary Ukraine. But tomorrow, we are very happy to invite you, if you have time and if it is possible, to maybe to use subtitles in Zoom for translating, because tomorrow Sergei Vinichenko will be taking an interview. Serежа?
Це буде інтерв'ю про інші терени, не харківські. Вони будуть закарпатські. Точніше, ми будемо говорити з Річардом з міста Ужгород.
So, we will speak to Richard, who is not from Kharkiv, but who is from Ужгород. It is the western part of our country. And this Richard is absolutely unique because режисер і актор, да? He is the director.
Він не режисер, він просто актор і директор, художній керівник. Він не режисер.
So, he is the director of, як називається театр?
Закарпатський драматичний театр.
Закарпатський Dramatic Theatre in Ужгород. Транскопесен, прикарпатський, окей? And he is the actor himself. So, we'll have an interview with him tomorrow.
Я не знаю, чи, можливо, хтось з сьогоднішніх учасників наважиться поставити запитання щодо чоловічої сили Річарда завтра актору, який грає Річарда. Якщо ніхто цього не зробить, то я обіцяю зробити це сам.
Не поспішай, я ж не встигаю.
Послідовний переклад.
I suppose that Sergei is greatly impressed with Irina Bezrodny's question about the masculine power of Richard III. And he's not sure that any of us will be brave enough tomorrow to ask this question to Rudolf, who is the actor. But я половину перевела. Не знаю, чи хтось наважиться, але...
Якщо ніхто не наважиться, то обіцяю зробити це за вас.
So, he promises us to put this question. Irina Bezrodnych, be attentive during tomorrow's meeting.
Вітання з українського Харкова, хоча тут повз мене ходять, вони, звісно, іншою мовою якоюсь розмовляють, і тут ще роботи і роботи, почати і закінчити. Але ми робимо те, що ми робимо на тому місці, де ми знаходимося. Я радий вас всіх бачити, і завтра до зустрічі.
So, Sergei is very happy to see all of you here in this virtual room, and he says that he sends his best wishes from Kharkiv, that is quite near the front zone. So our soldiers are on the front zone, and then they come to spend at least some hours to sleep, etc., etc. In it's difficult to say peaceful atmosphere, but something like that. And we do believe that tomorrow Sergei will be able to join us and his commander will permit him to do it. Сергій командир дозволить, я так сподіваюся, вже домовився, так? And
Саме так. Так є.
and he, as the person to whom we are very much obliged for defending, ми дуже тобі вдячні за захист, will be also the partner of our communication, and not only the partner of or reviewer of Rudolf Dzurинець, who is the actor, but also he will be that very person who will put a lot of provocative questions. I know Sergei for some years, and I have no doubts. So it will be interesting. All of you are welcome to join us tomorrow, but not at 7, but at 20, because Sergei has a lot of job as a soldier. So at 20 or 8 p.m. in Ukraine, we are here in this virtual hall. So we are very grateful to everybody. Hope to see you tomorrow. Have a quiet night.
Have a quiet night. Thank you very much once more for having us. Thank you everybody for turning up, and sleep
Love to England.
tight and safely. Thank you.
Love
you.
to England.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.